Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 10th paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of von Vom Krige, title being "The probabilities of real life take the place of the conceptions of the extreme and the absolute." So here we go. In this manner, the whole act of war is removed from the rigorous law of forces exerted to the utmost. If the extreme is no longer to be apprehended and no longer to be sought for, it is left to the judgment to determine the limits for the efforts to be made in place of it, and this can only be done on the data furnished by the facts of the real world, by the laws of probability. Once the belligerents are no longer mere conceptions, but individual states and governments, once the war is no longer an ideal, but a definite substantial procedure, then the reality will furnish the data to compute the unknown quantities which are required to be found. From the character, the measures, the situation of the adversary, and the relations with which he is surrounded, each side will draw conclusions by the law of probability as to the designs of the other and act accordingly. So here von Clausewitz has finally concluded from the last paragraph the series of 3 demonstrations ex absurdo from the characteristics that an absolute war would have had, and that he gave fundamentally in the 6th paragraph. So we can repeat them just to make clarity. The first, absurdity. Let's say war becomes a completely isolated act which arises suddenly and is in no way connected with the previous history of the combatant states. From this, he demonstrated in the 7th paragraph that war is never an isolated act. From the second, that war is limited to a single solution or to several simultaneous ones. He draws the second, which is war does not consist of a single instantaneous blow. And 3, if this war contains within itself the solution perfect, this war contains within itself the solution perfect and complete, free from any reaction upon it, through a calculation beforehand of the political situation which will follow from it, he derives the third, that the result in war is never absolute. Last time we had a comment that was pointing out fundamentally, but the result can be absolute in the sense that if I literally wipe out the enemy, which might happen, this can happen. Here, absolute is not meant, first of all, in terms of the result, because war is always kind of floating within politics, and there's never war without politics in this sense. So what happens as in terms of a actual annihilation of the enemy is still not an absolute result, because the result could have been differently delivered in theory to the utmost use of force. So in this sense, absolute doesn't mean absolute in physical terms. It means fundamentally in its true etymological meaning in Latin, which means absolutus. That means basically absolved, uncontrolled, unrestrained. So that's what absolute means, and that's why war is never absolute, because war is never delivered in one shot. It's never something that in fact responds to these other characteristics. It never consists of a single instantaneous blow, and it's never an isolated act. Therefore, the result in war is never absolute. It never comes, even if you annihilate the enemy, out of the absolute, the utmost exertion of forces. This is very important. So in this 10th paragraph, instead, what we have is the fundamentally the logical conclusion and the logical consideration that you can draw from these 3 statements that have been defined, and has to do with fundamentally the empirical answer. We have seen now, we're kind of getting used, by reading now at this point in von Clausewitz, between theory and practice. There is a theory with principles that kind of dictate how the thing works, but there is eventually the reality in which these principles are always valid. but they kind of assume other forms because of contingent factors. And in the case of war, because war is limited fundamentally by what all the characteristics that we have seen, and is merely a tool of politics, and therefore it cannot be led to the extreme and to the absolute, because if it was such, we would be talking fundamentally about, I don't know, a metaphysical war. And I mean literally metaphysical in the sense that it goes beyond physics, because certain ways of delivering violence, as war is an act of violence, have by themselves certain physical limits that you cannot go beyond which you can't go. And by this same condition, war is always controlled and modified in its use. So the question is, how should fundamentally lead to the extreme and to the absolute, tend to the extreme to the absolute, because that's still our objective. That's still what war functions like. And in order to reach its aim, to disarm the enemy, fundamentally that's the direction you have to take. You can't take another one. But there are certain limitations that you have to deal with that are not eliminable. And here basically the answer is you have to count. You have to look at the laws of probability, as von Clausewitz calls them in German, the Wahrscheinlichkeitsgesetzen. So literally the laws of probability, in fact. Wahrscheinlichkeit means probability, and Gesetz here the plural means law. So the that's the question. It's also a very if you want, theoretical question, because also the laws of probability, and this is what we'll see in the Vom Krige, are not always to be given. I mean, laws of probability are always there, but I mean the way you can calculate that probability, that chance, is often beyond your reach, especially during war in itself, because of the fog of war, because of attrition. So also in here, yeah, you should base yourself on this kind of chance that has to be understood and broadly meant. Wahrscheinlichkeit here means literally the something that is, it's not just probable, but it's let's say plausible, because wahr in German, in fact, it's true. So it's not really something you can determine so easily all the time. So even the translation laws of probability, you don't have to think about generals looking at calculators and saying, okay, let's see how probable this is and let's go for it and decide. No, because most of the times, actually all the times, there is an approximate calculation in this sense. There is an approximate way of determining certain things, and therefore this already gives you the idea that war is nothing scientific in the way it's rather an art than anything that can be positivistically understood. So this is actually a pretty simple paragraph that sums up, as we were saying, the conclusions coming from the previous paragraphs. So it's relatively simple to understand, but it kind of clarifies this point of how practically war is led, war is waged in terms of actual action. So in this manner, von Clausewitz says, the whole act of war is removed from the rigorous law of forces exerted to the utmost. We have seen that, theoretically speaking, if war was a metaphysical entity abstract from all reality, so unconditioned by any other factor, including politics, that is, that we give also in here for detached fundamentally, in order to consider an absolute war, the forces exerted by the two wrestlers would have to be exerted to the utmost. We have seen also in the previous paragraph that there are, in this conception, no allies, nothing. So it's pure abstraction in many ways, not just pure theory, because the theory is what you derive from it, but this is kind of an unreal situation. So von Clausewitz is explaining that you can't basically follow this rigorous law when you think about war. You know that that's how it should work. That's how it works practically, but fundamentally it's always limited, controlled, modified. Then it says, if the extreme is no longer to be apprehended and no longer to be sought for, it is left to the judgment to determine the limits for the force to be made in place of it, and this can only be done on the data furnished by the facts of the real world, by the laws of probability. So as we were saying before, this means that, okay, you're on your own out there. You have to fundamentally judge what's best in determining how much effort you have to make in this war, and theoretically at least, the way you should carry out this, I mean theoretically and practically, but is to base yourself on the data offered by the facts of the real world. Then it says, by the laws of probability. So this is, as we were saying before, very theoretical, because naturally the laws of probability also have to be assessed in some way. What is more probable, and how do you calculate that? Something may be probable, but how do you calculate the probability in turn? So, of course, statistics works with its own laws, but also these laws are like the laws of the rigorous law of forces that we have just discarded. So the real problem here is you have a theory, but you also have a practice, and calculating this probability in practice can be extremely difficult. So this doesn't just this statement doesn't just describe a theoretical aspect, but also tells you that fundamentally how you have to cope with this, practically speaking, as well. Then he says, once the belligerents are no longer mere conceptions but individual states and governments, once the war is no longer an ideal but a definite substantial procedure, then the reality will furnish the data to compute the unknown quantities which are required to be found. So also in here it's basically a repetition of the previous statement, just addressing the fact that it's individual states and governments that wage war. When this becomes is not longer an ideal, so it has become real war, and it has to be operated with a procedure on its own that is substantial, is definite, it's real. In fact, it's only on the base of the data, this data furnished by reality, that and by experience, and also by this other knowledge that we know about war fundamentally, because this is also to be taken into account. It's not just mere realization what you have around at the moment. It's also understanding what war is in terms of previous through doctrine, to military theory, to mere practice, etc. Also, very importantly, here says that reality furnishes data that is required to be found. So this already introduces to the problem we hinted at now, of the difficulties in fact finding this, and this is still, you see how von Clausewitz proceeds here, is still in the realm of theory. So this is what you gather to. Then how this actually will happen, I'll show you how it is. This is way more complicated and difficult, and that leads to a series of other considerations that have to be borne in mind when thinking about war. Then he concludes saying, from the character, the measures, the situation of the adversary and the relations with which he is surrounded, the adversary is surrounded, each side will draw conclusions by the law of probability as to the designs of the other, and act accordingly. So this is also interesting naturally, and he lists fundamentally the conditions that affect the way war is actually fought. From one side you have the character. So really the individual character, or the character in the sense of the whatever state of the government is. And this is very important because in this character you can put literally everything in terms of culture, beliefs, characteristics also of other more kind of material aspects of this foe, fundamentally how he operates and therefore his resources, etc. Then the measures then that are given in this sense also by all these factors that we have listed before. I mean, in terms of first of all what the political mandate is. So here the measure is dictated fundamentally by politics. There is never this is important in thinking von Clausewitz, is that basically you never have a moment in which politics finishes and war starts. I mean, war is constantly, this is the objective, the conclusion he draws from the previous 3 paragraphs. The war is constantly controlled and modified by politics. So there's never a moment in which politics says, okay, war is left on its own. It's always inextricably intertwined to war. And actually war and politics have 2 different domains on their own. They're not the same thing. They have its own laws, if you want. The ones of war are the ones that interest von Clausewitz, and the one of politics are way more complicated. But fundamentally, these 2 elements never, especially politics, never leaves the grip on war. That's why, in fact, the probabilities of real life take the place of the conceptions of the extreme and the absolute, because war never gets to them, because it's controlled by politics, and there can't be any war by definition that is not constantly controlled and modified by politics. So there's nothing like that. No general, just to make an example, is given the mandate of achieving victory without modifications. That's the real point. So you don't have to look at the result in terms of who's left on the ground, fundamentally, how much you have actually damaged the enemy or stuff like that. That's not the point. The point is that you've never done that, you never achieved that at the fullest, let's say, of your possibilities. Because even if you had done it, you would still have some limits that are given by space, by physics, let's say, and it never happens. It never happens. But especially it's politics that has this major impact on the way war is waged, together with naturally other. The measures in here. You have politics. You have the limits of the country. We have seen it in the previous paragraphs. There can be the intervention of external actors, like the allies from both sides, etc. Then also there is the situation of the adversary that we have seen before. Fundamentally, it's one of the reciprocal relations that von Clausewitz draws. That is, there is this sort of inertia laying into human nature that makes you always tend to relax and not to make fundamentally I don't know how you say in English, but certain words, some of the simplest the hell are not here, in fact, just to avert, let's say, to avert, but this is bad. There is no proper translation, but let's say it makes you go away tendentially from this great force this great exhaustion, greater. Also in here, there is nothing like that translatable in the language. Whatever. Fine. However, the idea is clear. These men tend always to make the least effort as possible, to reason economically speaking, to reason in a way that, in fact, even in terms of the law of statistics, has its own. The laws of probability has its own importance. You tend always. War is something extremely demanding in terms of energies, of resources. A fight always is. So at that point, you should find a way, not just before, but even during the fight, of economizing of your efforts. And when you and since it's something that really that demands a lot, as we have seen, also the action of the enemy will fundamentally dictate the amount of effort you're committing, because if the enemy grows exhausted and you're exhausted too, you tend to slow down a little bit. So even though you have other energies you're kind of that you could deliver in case of a greater emergency during that fight, even in that same moment, you tend to preserve them, to draw back. So it's as if you in fact went in parallel, in part against the same laws of war, because reality in fact modifies it accordingly. And there is also this fact, this greater the inertia in here is important. But not the inertia, because inertia is something that goes on without, but the also in here no proper translation that I can find. But I hate how sometimes in different languages you have brilliant definitions that in your own brilliant words that in your own you don't have, but when you go to translate even some of the simplest concepts, maybe that language doesn't have it expressed in the same with the same efficacy of your own. So it's kind of disheartening sometimes. But I believe the concept is clear, that you don't just act fundamentally, you don't make your effort during the combat in the measure you would do without constraints. You would also you're always constrained, and you basically also constrain yourself looking at the situation of the adversary, depending on how the enemy reacts. So fundamentally hiding in this possibility that things will get better after some time, this hope that most of the times is actually irrational, and this is also what von Clausewitz says, is fundamentally damaging overall, because if war was it was absolute, in fact, but even when it's not, the tendency would always be to solve this as quickly as possible, because of attrition and other problems. The longer you delay the resolution of this, the solution of this conflict and of this war, at least, and the more damage in absolute terms is caused to the whole system, say, in terms of sheer destruction. So this is never to be forgotten. There are certain reciprocal laws that bring you to limit yourself, also on the base of the enemy, of the foe. And in here, von Clausewitz says is that war is also heavily conditioned by the relations with which the foe is surrounded, fundamentally, and you as well, because this goes both sides naturally. So if the enemy has valid allies, you think twice before doing certain things, at least as long as these allies are a real threat. So even in there, you may not know what those allies are up to, whether they're gonna intervene or not. As we have seen, it frequently happens that allies do not intervene at the beginning of the hostilities, or you don't have this immediate knowledge about their intervention. They tend to, certainty about their intervention. They tend to intervene once the fight has already started, so to re-equilibrate fundamentally the relation of force, also because they have interests on their own that are not necessarily perfectly driven by this 100% friendliness and support to their ally. So this is also another very and the same goes for your own allies that fundamentally are generally friends of yours, but you're not in their mind. They're not gonna necessarily spend all of their resources immediately at once just for it. In reality, just because they are your friends. In reality, this never happens. This is always delayed. This is always, in fact, going very far from the extreme and the absolute. Always bear in mind that we've seen it before, that if war was extreme and absolute, there wouldn't even be a need to fight it, because everybody would know the outcome already, so there would be a sort of freezing for which all the relation of forces of states and governments would be perfectly calculated in 1 second, and there would be no need to all conflicts would be solved fundamentally. In one instant, and wouldn't be even solved with violence. It would translate, the whole thing would be translated into a algebraic calculation, as von Clausewitz puts it. And it's true, in fact, and that's the reason why this uncertainty, this fog of war, this attrition that intervenes, at all times into war, makes it everything but extreme and absolute. So, on the base of all these data furnished by reality, each side will draw conclusions by the law of probability as to the designs of the other, and act accordingly. So here von Clausewitz makes an interesting distinction, in my opinion, because it says, previously he has underlined this laws of probability as essentially the way you realize it. So here introduces also another element in the way that are the designs of the enemy, of your own. I mean, you have not just a mechanical world to scope in here to determine how, probabilistically speaking, something will happen. You can apply the law of probability when you do things like, I don't know, let's suppose you have to make your army march into a certain road, and you know that this because you know it, this road has certain characteristics. So at that point you can calculate in theory, on the base of maybe of previous experience or other knowledge that you have, how marching on that road would create in terms of attrition, of problems. So you don't know how it eventually things will go, because this is also one point, that is, you can't fundamentally calculate. It's a probability. You're not certain by definition by what the result will be. So let's assume that on all the data, on the base of all the data you have, you determine that your army will march along that road for 30 minutes. So maybe at the end of the day, you know that 30 minutes will be 31, 29, 32, it depends, but you still know on the base of that data that it would have not been 40 minutes nor 20 minutes, but something around 30. Always given that you're taking, in fact, that road as the only factor. Then maybe your army is marching along that road and gets, I don't know, attacked by air, by bombers, and you you know, and then the army slows down. So obviously everybody flees. The column gets disrupted. They run. They throw themselves into the surrounding fields, and that really complicates the thing. So and before that army puts itself together, before the planes are gone away, and everything goes, a certain amount of time has passed, and therefore you should have considered also in here the laws of probability that air attack would happen. Now the problem is, most of the times you don't know that would happen. I mean, there is a probability that it will happen, but it's kind of difficult to calculate. What's the probability? How do you know what's the enemy up to? So at that point you should also have spies that maybe are infiltrated into the enemy headquarters, and for some lucky way for some miracle are able to determine to tell you in time that air attack would arrive. So the problem is, what are the probabilities that spies will succeed in delivering you that information? So you have to calculate this, and you realize that if you add factor after factor after factor, that in war happens continuously, and with so many factors that you can't dominate, in here things are gonna get pretty complicated. So, but going back to the distinction I wanted to point out is, in fact, is that you have to not just take into account the laws of probability, because the laws of probability are, in a certain sense, can contain the whole knowledge you have, but within this knowledge, what is really important also is the design of the enemy. So even if you have no actual that's what von Clausewitz makes it as a distinction in one of the previous paragraphs we have seen. It's much easier to assess what are the resources of the enemy rather than what that his spirit is about, what his plans are, what his moral resources are, that are much more difficult to assess. So in a way, the designs of the enemy are also particularly important, because also here a plan, for instance, is more or less capable, and what you do when you're at war is not just you can never calculate your can never plan your operations without thinking constantly all the times what the enemy response can be. There is the constant reciprocity, is it the right word, between your actions and the ones of the enemy, and in order to know them, a great deal of calculation is spared from a strictly physical point of view by knowing, in fact, the military art. So therefore, putting yourself in the shoes of the enemy, and on the base of what you know in terms of at least of resources that he has, physical resources, in part also the moral ones that are more difficult to find, but at least to know what are his options, what could be their intentions if you were him. So you never make a plan just, let's say, like staging a play, like saying, okay, it's just about me, whatever happens from the other side doesn't matter. No, you have to think this constantly with what the enemy can do, and every step you take you have to consider it. So you understand how complicated this can be. I don't know if you ever had to solve an exercise of such a military problems, like at a tactical, so strategical level. They're extremely complicated most of the times, and they're not so intuitive. You have to calculate it, really, like as if it was an equation, and you have to take into consideration so many factors. So it's very complicated. And the worst is that in war you don't have the luxury of sitting comfortably on a chair and thinking it through on your own with all the time you want. You have to figure it out as soon as possible, because the longer it takes, the more men die, and you know by certainty that you're always kind of faulty in some way. So there are always people who are gonna die because of your decisions in a way or another. What you have to hope is to reduce this to the minimum, in order also to achieve the goal that can be achieved, by the way, also by sacrificing men's lives, because men's lives do have a cost, economically speaking, and it's sad to say, but there is. Then you may have, let's say, other moral feelings, and this influence in war as well. But that's what it is, and there is only one solution that is theoretically the best. It is a bit like tending to the extreme, to the absolute, but he already knows that cannot be achieved, and that everything has to be built realistically and practically and empirically and approximately, step by step. You have to modify your plans constantly, because there is no way out of it otherwise. Always bear in mind that you are fighting against a reacting mass. You're not the leader. You don't necessarily conduct the dance, let's say. The enemy can get over, can take the control of the situation, and at that point to kind of dictate you how the thing has to evolve. And believe me, there are situations in which at one point there's not much you can do, at least in certain limited scenarios. Once you fail at one point, you have no options but fundamentally going back until the enemy is able to finds the condition to push you back, and there's not much you can do. So this is particularly useful. I don't know, we could make war games actually one time. I had this kind of thing back in the past to fundamentally draw fake maps of and solving problems with this military problems and it's really fun actually, but it's also very complicated. It also takes a lot of time to prepare a scenario and stuff, and it's a very serious thing. You have to give certain conditions, you have to take everything into account. It can take really a lot of time in order to solve it. So it's, we could do it once just to show you. By the way, there is something from Clausewitz that can also be used, because that was a game that they also made often, because actually these officers were taught since they were cadets, fundamentally, especially when they were cadets, to solve such problems. And they had to do it very quickly, and they could, while intelligent people today may have an extreme difficulty just for saying that it takes a particular ability, a particular education, a particular mindset to solve certain problems. Most of the people do not know what these problems are really about, because if they were acquainted with them and they understood what they are about, which is already kind of a challenge for many people, I believe, they would understand much better what war really is, in terms of not on the wake of emotions like war is terrible, people die, suffering, etc. That is something that the soldier naturally experiences on the field, and it's terrible. But that soldier experiences that because there is someone on the top that is sort of figuring out those war games, because these are war games for real. That's how, strategically speaking, these are solved and thought through, and they are as important as you know, they're actually more important than what the individual soldier does on the field. And that's why such decision and leadership, etc., and planning is fundamental to any war, and why fundamentally, actually, in war, by not by law but by rule, it's the most intelligent that wins, not the strongest one. Because war presents you with so many situations into which you have to think it through, that you can also have all the strength in the world, but if you don't know how to use it, you're done for. You're gonna be eaten alive. So that's the real point. And it takes some experience. I've unfortunately stopped to play those. They were not even war games because I created them myself, or at least I've seen a bunch of them, but they're not like those board games like the ones that usually war gamers are really about, because those are kind of other things. They're very schematic. They tend to actually simplify other than showing the real complexity of war. These are problems you have to solve, with paper and pencil and ruler, and they're not easy. They're not easy like a game that has rules and you can follow them, and you win. You can have some ability in thinking it through, but it's all too approximate. That's the problem with war games in the way you know them, in terms of the wargaming communities that are out there, is that as accurate they can be, they tend brutally to simplify. And by the way, they bring to certain substantial problems, in my opinion, that have to do with also the way you think through these things, because you think that war can be that schematic, but telling the truth, it's not. And that's what von Clausewitz teaches, while there were other thinkers that fundamentally believed that the war could be synthesized in such let's say fundamental dynamics. Well, von Clausewitz tells you that real war goes far beyond this, and that there are so many factors at once that are basically impossible to consider all at once. So that real war is fought in a very different way from what is usually, what a positivistic mind is usually prone to think. And finally, they act. Both wrestlers act accordingly. So that's how they act. They don't act on the base of an absolute, on the base of an extreme, this utmost exertion of forces. It's always calibrated, very carefully calibrated, in a world that is full of unknown also. And this here is not being stressed, but it's being hinted at by von Clausewitz, and here, especially on the political act, we will be more clear in the next paragraph, that is in fact about the political object now reappears. So that's what those further considerations are taken from. And we have a beautiful series of other considerations that we will leave for the other times. And I'm happy because we're not speeding excessively with von Clausewitz now, but we have reached already a tiny, I'm seeing it here on the bar while scrolling down. We have already discussed something. It will take a lot, hopefully, because I like things that last, and to finish the Vom Krige, but having already arrived at this point, it's not bad, though it's still the very beginning in many ways. So for now, other considerations, I don't know. I think it's better to leave them for the next paragraph that is very much more substantial and interesting. For now, and also this one was important, but it's a sort of kind of a middle ground that leads to the following. You understand now. You got acquainted how von Clausewitz works. It's very patiently, logically, step by step. He takes his time because he needs to make you understand well certain things, and so it is. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, you will leave a like or a dislike if I deserve a dislike. And otherwise, subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents, because that's basically how it works. You know, you subscribe, you get the notification from the from me every time I make a new video, so you can keep or my videos are suggested to you more frequently and stuff like that, fundamentally. So it's fine. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.